Good morning, afternoon or evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Bo Ferdinand Moxel Fatum from Lillebælt Academy in Denmark, Odense, or the University of Applied Science. This lecture is about one of the three legs of a tripod of sustainability, and so it's the tourism impacts and sustainability. This will be on the economic bit, economic impacts on tourism, and the next will be on the socio-cultural and then the environmental impacts on tourism. So the first one, I'll show a PowerPoint presentation now. First, I will show you this book, their version on economic tourism impacts. It's done by Michael Løk and other authors, there's three of them, and I'll do one on, in continuation of this, on Holloway. You can look that up as well. So, start here. This is the book I just held up and showed you before. So, tourism and sustainability. This, obviously, you need to understand the various forms of tourism resources, and I'm going to talk about carrying capacity. And then one of them is the nature of economic impacts. Social-cultural and environmental impact would be the following lectures. And then I'll discuss at the end sustainability and sustainable tourism. If you're watching the news, COP21, EU, the big leaders of the world, they have made agreements as to reduce the CO2 emissions from factories and cars and so on, and they've done a really good deal. So sustainability is a big issue at the moment. And the last bit is the management techniques, how to use the resources optimally. So these are the three bits. You got the economic, which is this lecture, and environmental and socio-cultural tourism impacts. Interrelationship is just a fancy word for inter being Latin, between, so relationship, so some relationship between these three. Usually people talk only about, when you're talking about sustainability or tourism impact, you talk about environmental. But obviously you need to make money on tourism, and to make money you have to measure how much, and these are ways of doing this. So you got different categories of tourism resources. You got the natural ones, and you got the types and examples. So the natural ones could be forest, beaches, wildlife, and so on. And the cultural ones could be churches, temples, historic buildings, ethnic celebrations, and so on. And events, music, art, sports, and activity, golf courses, swimming pools, and the services, airports, hotels, and tourist information. Now, being a marketing lecturer as well, if you look at these categories, types and examples, now you have a little think about it. You can pause this to have a think which ones are public of the examples and which ones are private. Public being having the main interest of satisfying the locals for education and information, and the privates, their mission or their goal is always a higher turnover, more guests and more money. So if you look at the first one, you can press play now again. So the first one, natural resources, well, nobody owns them except for the government or the state or the counties or the municipalities, so you cannot really charge money to go into a forest or a beach. You can charge different prices on maybe some areas of the beach. That's not really popular around these parts. And then also churches, you cannot charge money for that. Historic buildings, well, difficult really to charge money for it, because they're usually also governmentally owned or ran. So, but the last bit, events, well, some of you are studying events as well. So you got all these events, music, art, sport, trade shows, spoken word, films and film festivals. You got loads of them. You can charge money for that for entry or participation. And also the activities as well. Golf courses, you know that they're not free. Swimming pools are not free either. Museums, they're usually publicly owned, but you can charge entry fee. In theatres, zoos, theme parks. At the moment in Copenhagen, they're thinking about the National Museum of Art. It's free to get in, but they have applied to the government to be listed as a private company so that they can charge an entrance fee, because they think that the huge deficit they have, being publicly funded and not being able to charge entry fee, they think they can turn this round to a profit by charging entry fee. So, but that's a discussion you can have. And then services, obviously, that's why you're studying tourism, tourism business management, airports, hotels, tourist information, network, maps, all this stuff. They're usually part of the they are part of the tourism industry, and this is how you make money. And they will keep developing. So if you get any fancy ideas, you can make a lot of money if you can find more services to sell. Just think about, for instance, airlines, how much you have to cross out. Do you want extra leg space, cancellation fee, change the name to swap into another name? I mean, if somebody else is supposed to use your ticket, if you get ill, in case the company goes bankrupt, you need to pay for food, for drinks, probably the toilet soon. But all these things are service developments in order to make more money on the guests. So back to carrying capacity. You got 4 here. So one is the physical carrying capacity, and that is, see if it's on the next slide. That's not in it. Physical carrying capacity is usually how many people can be at a site, and you can measure this easily. And also the ecological and biological, that's a little difficult, more difficult to measure. And the psychological carrying capacity is even more difficult to measure. The physical, well, you can see how many people can be at one place at one time physically. That's to do with space and the guests or parking lots. And then you can decide, and usually it's decided on the maximum, not the ideal. The ecological and biological carrying capacity, usually to do with nature, wildlife, very difficult. And the discussion is usually between biologists and the privately owned tourism entities. And then the psychological carrying capacity, that's between how many, well, it can also be for the guest's point of view, but how many people would you like to be with when you're in a certain place? Like if you're hiking, certain people want to meet a lot of people, certain people don't want to meet any off the beaten track, or in a museum, how many people can be there? Psychological, if in a swimming pool, for instance, or an amusement park, certain people and other people have different views on how many people they can handle being with at a certain point in time. And then you got the social capacity, carrying capacity, and that's usually to do with the local area. How would they respond to too many guests at once? I know that the only place in Denmark where I come from is the island of Bornholm, close to here. That's where I'm from, and we have a limit to the amount of tourists must never supersede or exceed the amount of guests. I hope I said that right. So there's about 45,000 people on it, locals, and there must never be more than that amount of guests. So 45,000 Bornholm people, we can never have more than 45,000 tourists at once, and that is stated in the tourism planning policy. Then you got this is a guy called Doxy. It's called Iridex, obviously to do with irritation. So it's a social capacity, carrying capacity. So I will stop here because, let me see. No, I will continue. I was thinking about only touching upon the economic carrying capacity, but this covers it as well. So this is the social carrying capacity from a host community. So the first, you should really be numbers here. First, when you introduce tourism, you're euphoric, you're happy. Hey, we got tourists, we're making money. And then you can go into apathy, being a bit more disliking the guests, and then you can become irritated, annoyed, and that's the nearly the final stage. Antagonism is when you really hate tourists. So these are the different stages, and you probably know the PLC, the product life cycle. You can use that for destinations as well. Introduction, growth, maturity and decline. Obviously you can maybe put them in if you think that's a good idea, but to start with tourism, you're usually happy, and then as mass tourism evolves, usually that's the way it happens, from niche tourism or small scale tourism into mass tourism, and that's when you become pathetic or irritated with the customer or the tourists. Now here we got ways of measuring the economic benefits of tourism. So it's usually done in tourist arrivals, and the question is, how do you measure this? Press pause. Play. Well, you measure this by airports, because you obviously from the press you know there's something called the Schengen, open borders in the EU, 28 countries. So we don't measure how many guests, people come from one border to the other, because all the borders are open. We had something called the border control border control calculation organization. Anyway, people stood by the border clicking on a meter saying 1 tourist, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you knew exactly how many people from other countries entered your country from the border. And then you could see international tourist arrivals as well. But Schengen, the deal was to open the borders, so that's not calculated anymore. So you got the tourist arrivals, and another thing is usually the bed nights, because I know by Danish law, if you got more than 25 beds in a bed and breakfast, a hotel, a hostel, whatever, 25 beds, you need to register to Danish statistics to show how many guests have you got, 1 to 2 days, up to week, to months, to years. So you have to report this, so we can see how many tourist arrivals and bed nights you have. These are statistics, yeah. So you got the, obviously, you know, you can see here that the international tourist arrivals for Europe, that's the biggest tourist destinations you could say, Europe here, and it's growing. If you want the newest figures, you can go on to UNWTO, as you see, to get the newest figures, because Europe consists of a lot of countries, obviously. And you can see Asia, Americas, that's North and South, and Africa. And if you didn't know it, have a little guess, how many countries in Africa? Last time I saw it was 53. 53 countries in the continent of Africa. And then you got the Middle East as well. And then you got tourist arrivals and receipts. So France has the most arrivals, but the US has most tourist receipts. And so you can see there's a relationship between the arrivals and the actual receipts. With France is leading the US, China and Spain. And you can see, let me see, where's China? Yeah, China's the third on tourist arrivals, 55,000 million, and then you got countries, let me see which China is, 45. Yeah. If you want other countries, you can look into the UNWTO quantitative statistics. And again, Germany here. But these are ways of measuring the tourism expenditure, how much the guests spend, the country spends. Then you can find out the economic benefits of tourism. And then it starts into the socio-cultural. Then I'll stop here and move on to a different author, Holloway, on the economic impacts. So you don't just get one. Let me see, that's the one. So here we go. No, that's not the one. Let me see. It's here. Can I have a little break? I'll find it. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. So this is Holloway, a different author. This is a bit more in depth. Economic impacts of tourism. So you got international tourist arrivals again. This is done from the 50s, introducing mass tourism, jumbo jets, all that stuff. 60s, 70s, Boeings, all that stuff. And then, down to 2009. In 2007 you can see the drop. 9/11 that were. 2009, that was 9/11. So obviously has a bit of a stop in the tourist arrivals and receipts. Then you got domestic versus international tourism. Domestic and international. Now let's see, what springs in mind is, so domestic trips. The US have a lot of domestic trips, obviously 50 states, so there's a lot to see. So they do a lot of domestic tourism, and they have a lot of international arrivals, but the domestic is the biggest, and also the Chinese, their market is the domestic. I mean, Americans traveling within the US and Chinese traveling within the US. In India the same, Brazil the same, and Japan and France the same, and the UK. So there's not really, well, Austria, that's 50-50 I suppose. So you got two kinds of calculating this, the net travel propensity and the gross travel propensity. And the first one, just the percentage of the population that travel, but the other one is the actual number of trips taken. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah? So it's the total number of trips taken in relation to the size of the country. And so then you got the demand issue here. So you got demand levels. It could be relative cost compared to income, influence of exchange rates. Obviously we've got the euro, so that's changed a lot. In the old days you had to pay exchange rates for going into Deutschmark and franc and all different currencies, so that's done away with. And also you need to think about the time to travel, and if you get a paid holiday entitlement, that influences the kind of demand on it. Obviously the first one, relative cost compared to income, if it's really expensive compared to what you earn in a country, you will probably not travel abroad. You probably do some domestic trips instead, if you have a means of doing that. And then the other one is ease of access to the destination, and that's logistics again, or planning of tourism. It would be a good idea to have international airports if you want to have international tourism, and bigger runways now. I know our Copenhagen airport is expanding into the new Boeing, I think, or Airbus, I cannot remember. But they've done a new runway. It would cost a lot more than they're making on the actual arrival of the airplane. But they predict in the future that's the way to go. And also here, ease of travel to the destination, cost of travel. If you have a little think about it, how can low-budget airlines sell it so cheap that it's even cheaper than going by train from A to B, or even going by car? I mean, how can they get it? I mean, you can travel to London, Paris, Rome, whatever, for nearly a third of the cost of going by a train or bus, or even more expensive to travel by car. So other economic factors are the income of the guest or customer, of course, employment rate in the country can affect tourism, and the balance of payments, but that's more fiscal, meaning the government balance of payments, import and export usually here, yeah? You have to have an equilibrium, which means a balance between import and export to have a sound financial situation in a country. And then you got investment and development. I know the EU funds a lot of investment and development around the EU for different purposes, and you can actually apply for these if you are have a public company or a public company. You can fulfill these requirements, usually done by the EU. You can apply a lot of money from them to invest and develop, and that's usually to do with social heritage again, the UNESCO. So let's see, income in depth here, generated through higher wages or lower wages, interest rates, the rent, the business profits, the taxes. These are all economic factors that influence the income of tourism. If you think about it, there's something called what's it called? Satellite. A satellite. The TSA, the tourism satellite account, that takes into some of these factors. And then you got employment. So you got tourism is usually a low wage job. Like if you got big transnational companies entering the scene, well then usually the management positions are taken by their staff. So they will have the higher employment. And then the low skilled jobs are usually done by the locals in many countries anyway. And then you got the seasonal and part-time work. So we have something called in Danish årsværk, and that would be seasonal and part-time work, where you have maybe 3 people putting their work together in a year. Maybe one works 3 months in a shop, and another one works 4 months in a ice cream shop, and that's 7 months, so up to 1 year. Then you would need 5 more months. So the next 5 months would maybe be done by a woman doing cleaning in a hotel. So those 3 would make up one full-time job, and that's how you calculate a full employment when you do the statistics anyway. And then the tourism balance of payments. And then there's 2 examples here. The country A, where the country receives 50 million from overseas tourists, and their residents spent 60 billion. So they got -10 in the balance of payments. And that's the way of calculating the economic factors. And another country has the opposite. Yeah. So they have 15 billion in surplus. And then you got investment and development. And it's often seen as risky. And so you need to attract tourists, but you need to invest as well. But who's going to invest? And usually it's done by half public, half private, but it depends on the country again. And then the public sector is always involved because they've got the locals to take care of as well. Because tourism it's not only for the tourist, the international tourist, it's also for the domestic tourist. Just a minute.